The nurse walked into the hospital waiting room at 3:47 in the morning, and I knew from the look on her face that my son had died. It wasn't the tears in her eyes, or the way she clasped her hands before speaking. It was something deeper, something a mother recognizes in the air when the life she brought into the world goes out. Timothy was only 17, and for the last 8 hours, I had held fast to my faith while the doctors begged, pleaded, practically knelt asking for permission to give him the blood transfusion that would save him. I said no. I said no because that was what Jehovah expected of me. I said no because the congregation elders were there with me, their Bibles open to Acts chapter 15, verse 29, assuring me I was making the right choice, the choice that would guarantee my son's eternal life. The car accident hadn't been his fault. A drunk driver ran a red light at the intersection near the Kingdom Hall where Timothy had just finished his volunteer cleaning shift. My son was driving home after serving Jehovah, fulfilling his responsibilities as a baptized young man, and he was struck by someone who had chosen the way of the world. The irony was so cruel it almost made me laugh, if my body still remembered how laughter worked. 2 years later, I was sitting in the same chair I always sat in at the Kingdom Hall, 3rd row on the left side, when Elder Robert Mitchell announced there was new light on the blood fractions issue. The Watchtower, in its wisdom, had received clearer understanding from Jehovah. Certain smaller blood fractions were now considered a matter of conscience. The treatment that could have saved Timothy was now on the list of acceptable procedures. I heard the words, but they came to me as if through water, distorted and unreal. My hands started to shake, and for the first time in 55 years of life, I felt something inside me break in a way I knew would never be fixed. This is the story of how I lost everything by obeying, and how that obedience turned out to be based on human interpretations that changed when it was already too late. This is the story of how the faith that was supposed to sustain me ended up destroying me. My name is Margaret Ann Whitmore, I am 55 years old, and I was born into the truth. My mother took me to meetings since before I could walk, strapped into one of those old-fashioned baby carriers while she went door to door in the south of England. I learned to read using Watchtower publications. My first clear memory is of sitting on my grandmother's lap during a talk about Armageddon, looking at the colorful illustrations of paradise while the speaker described the destruction that would come upon all who didn't serve Jehovah. I was 3 and already knew that the world outside was dangerous, controlled by Satan, and that only we, Jehovah's Witnesses, had the truth that would save humanity. Before I continue with what happened to Timothy, I need to ask something of you who are listening to me now. If this story touches your heart in any way, if you feel you need to hear it to the end, please subscribe to the channel. Hit the like button, because that helps more people find accounts like this, stories that need to be told even when they hurt so much it feels impossible to put them into words. And leave a comment telling me what city you're watching from. I want to know where you are. I want to feel that I am not alone in this emptiness my life has become. Tell me if you know someone who went through something similar, or if you yourself carry scars that no one else can see. I never imagined I would tell this story publicly. For 2 years, I kept everything inside, swallowing the pain in silence while I continued going to meetings, continued smiling at the brothers, continued pretending that my faith hadn't turned to ashes in my mouth. But something changed a few weeks ago. I was organizing Timothy's room, something I had avoided doing since his death, and I found his diary hidden under the mattress. Reading those pages, discovering the thoughts my son never shared with me, the doubts he hid so carefully during the meetings, was like losing him a second time. And I realized that if I didn't tell this story, if I didn't let the world know what really happens when doctrine meets real life, then Timothy's death would mean absolutely nothing. This is not just my story. It is the story of hundreds, perhaps thousands of families who sacrificed everything on the altar of obedience, only to discover that the men in Brooklyn who dictate these rules are as fallible as any other human being. Growing up as a Jehovah's Witness in 1970s and 80s England meant being different from every other child. While my classmates sang the national anthem at school assemblies, I sat in silence, staring at my shoes because I was taught that giving loyalty to any nation was idolatry. When there were birthday parties, I took home a polite note from my mother explaining that our religion did not allow pagan celebrations. Christmas, Easter, Halloween, all of it were Satan's traps designed to steer people away from true worship. I watched from the window as other children played without the restrictions that defined every aspect of my existence, and I told myself they were the unhappy ones, not me. They didn't have the truth. They wouldn't be saved when Jehovah destroyed this system of things. I was baptized at 13 during a district assembly in Manchester. There were 147 candidates in that inflatable pool set up in the stadium, all of us dressed in white, ready to symbolize our dedication to Jehovah. I remember the elder holding me under the water for that second that felt like an eternity, and how I felt when I emerged, water streaming down my face while thousands of witnesses applauded. I had chosen life. I had chosen the truth. That day should have been the happiest of my life, but all I can remember now is the weight of expectations that settled upon my shoulders, too young to carry them properly. I met James Whitmore when I was 21, during a regional convention in Birmingham. He was a regular pioneer, dedicating 70 hours a month to field service, and came from a family of elders and traveling overseers. Dating in the world was immoral, but dating another baptized young person under the careful supervision of our parents was not only allowed but encouraged. We married 6 months later, in a simple ceremony at the Kingdom Hall, no worldly music, no toasts, nothing that could offend Jehovah's conscience. Our honeymoon was in Brighton, where we spent 3 days knocking on doors in the mornings and walking on the beach in the afternoons, always accompanied by another couple because even married, we needed to maintain appearances. Timothy was born 2 years later, on a rainy March morning. The labor was difficult, 32 hours of work that ended in an emergency C-section, but when they placed that baby in my arms, wet and screaming and perfectly formed, I knew Jehovah had blessed me beyond anything I deserved. James held my hand and we prayed together, thanking him for the gift of this new life and promising to raise our son in the truth, protect him from the corrupting influences of Satan's world, mold him into a faithful servant who would bring glory to Jehovah's name. I didn't know then that those promises I made with such love and conviction would end up being the chains that prevented me from saving my son when he needed me most. We raised Timothy exactly as we were taught. Family worship every Monday night, where we studied Watchtower publications together. Meetings at the Kingdom Hall 3 times a week, no exceptions, even when Timothy was sick or exhausted. Field service every Saturday morning, knocking on doors with his little satchel full of Awake and the Watchtower magazines. He learned the basic presentation before he learned to tie his shoes. He learned to defend our position on blood, on political neutrality, on avoiding association with worldly people before he learned proper math. Timothy was an obedient child, quiet, the kind of boy the elders always used as an example during talks about raising children in the discipline and admonition of Jehovah. But there were moments, brief flashes that I chose to ignore at the time, when I saw something in my son's eyes that troubled me. A sadness, perhaps, or a loneliness that shouldn't exist in a child surrounded by hundreds of spiritual brothers and sisters. He never complained, never questioned openly, but sometimes I would catch him looking out the Kingdom Hall window during meetings, his eyes following the ordinary people walking on the street, living their ordinary lives, free from the weight of the truth that pressed his shoulders deeper and deeper as he grew. I told myself it was just a phase, that he would mature and become a strong elder like his father, a pillar in the congregation. I never imagined he would write in his diary, in small, desperate handwriting, that he felt like a prisoner in his own life, that he woke up every morning wishing he was anyone but who he was. Timothy was baptized at 15, earlier than most, because we wanted to protect him. A baptized young man had more responsibilities, yes, but he also had more structure, more reason to resist the temptations that came with adolescence. James was especially insistent about it. He saw how other youths in the congregation were starting to drift away, being influenced by schoolmates, experimenting with worldly dating, listening to music that glorified immorality. Our son would not be like them. Our son would be different. And Timothy, obedient as ever, agreed to the baptism even though I am certain now, after reading his diary, that he wasn't ready, that he was doing it to please us rather than out of genuine conviction. The night of October 15th started ordinary in every way. It was Thursday, meeting night at the Kingdom Hall. Timothy had stayed behind to help with cleaning, something baptized youths did on rotation. He was responsible for the bathrooms that week, a task he never complained about doing even though I knew he hated it. James had gone straight from work to an elders' meeting that would take place later. Southwest Timothy would drive home alone. He had gotten his driver's license 3 months earlier, and that little used car we bought him represented the only real freedom he had, those 15 minutes between the Kingdom Hall and our house where he could listen to whatever he wanted on the radio and think his own thoughts without anyone monitoring if they were appropriate or not. I was in the kitchen preparing the snack we always ate after meetings when the phone rang at 10:23. It was a number I didn't recognize, and when I answered, an official male voice asked if I was Timothy James Whitmore's mother. My stomach dropped before he even finished the sentence. There had been an accident. My son was at Royal Portsmouth Hospital. I needed to come immediately. The words came in fragments that my brain took too long to process. Serious injuries. Significant blood loss. Critical condition. We need to discuss treatment options. The drive to the hospital was a blur of streetlights and escalating panic. I managed to call James, who left the elders' meeting immediately. I called Elder Robert Mitchell, who said he would meet us at the hospital with the Hospital Liaison Committee, the special group of elders trained to handle medical situations involving Jehovah's Witnesses. They had documents, alternatives to blood transfusion, lawyers on standby in case the doctors tried to force treatment against our religious will. I thank Jehovah for us having this organization, this support, these people who would help us maintain our integrity even in terrible circumstances. The doctor who received us in the emergency room wasted no time on pleasantries. Timothy had suffered severe abdominal trauma and a ruptured spleen on impact. They had managed to stabilize him temporarily, but he was losing blood faster than they could replace it with volume expanders. He needed a blood transfusion, and he needed it now. Without it, he would die. With it, his chances of survival were excellent. It was that simple. Blood or death. Except that for us, for me, for James, for the elders who arrived 40 minutes later with their leather folders full of documents and Bible verses, it wasn't simple at all. It was the choice between obedience to Jehovah and obedience to the world. It was the choice between eternal life and temporary life. It was the choice between maintaining our integrity and giving in to the pressure of a medical system that didn't understand or respect our deeply held beliefs. Elder Mitchell opened his Bible to Acts chapter 15, verse 29, and read aloud, his voice firm and sure even while my son was bleeding to death 3 floors above us. That you keep abstaining from things sacrificed to idols, and from blood, and from what is strangled, and from sexual immorality. If you carefully keep yourselves from these things, you will prosper. The doctors alternated between clinical explanations and emotional pleas. A young surgeon, not much older than Timothy, held my hands and begged me to reconsider. She had tears in her eyes. She told me she had a brother Timothy's age. She told me there were alternative treatments, yes, but none that would work fast enough given the extent of my son's internal hemorrhage. She told me I had the legal power to save my son, and that she couldn't live with herself if she didn't do everything in her power to make me understand the seriousness of the situation. But the more she talked, the more I shut down. She didn't understand. She couldn't understand. This wasn't about medicine. It was about obedience to Jehovah, about loyalty to the biblical principles that governed every aspect of our lives. If I gave in now, if I allowed them to pump polluted blood into my son's body, I would be saying I didn't trust Jehovah to take care of him. I would be saying I had more faith in human science than in the Creator of the universe. James and I sat with the Hospital Liaison Committee in a cold conference room that smelled of disinfectant and despair. They reviewed all available alternative treatments. Non-blood volume expanders. Erythropoietin to stimulate red blood cell production. Minimally invasive surgery to control bleeding. Therapeutic hypothermia to reduce oxygen demand. The list was impressive, and they assured us that cooperative doctors had saved patients in similar situations using exactly these techniques. Elder Mitchell reminded us that Timothy had made his choice when he was baptized. He had dedicated his life to Jehovah. He had promised to obey biblical commands even if it cost him his life. We as parents had the responsibility to honor that dedication, not to betray the principles we had taught him since he was too small to understand what the words truly meant. At 2 a.m, the doctors told us that time was running out. Either they performed the transfusion in the next few hours or Timothy wouldn't see the sunrise. They asked to speak to Timothy directly to obtain his consent, but he was unconscious, sedated beyond the ability to communicate. I was his mother. I had medical authority. The choice was mine. And I, Margaret Ann Whitmore, raised in the truth, baptized at 13, married to an elder, a faithful mother for 17 years, looked at those tired, desperate doctors and told them no. Do not perform the transfusion. My son would rather die faithful to Jehovah than live having violated God's commands. The elders held my hands. James held my hands. And we all prayed, asking Jehovah to give the doctors strength to use the alternative methods, asking him to perform a miracle, asking him to show the world that his witnesses could remain integral even in the face of death. Timothy died at 3:47 in the morning. I was in the waiting room, surrounded by elders and sisters from the congregation who had come to support us. They were praying softly when the nurse walked in, and I knew before she spoke. I knew by the way she stopped at the door. I knew by the way her eyes sought mine. I knew by the way the whole world seemed to suck all the oxygen from the room, and leave only silence and the terrible certainty that I had just lost the only thing that truly mattered. Timothy's funeral was held at the Kingdom Hall 4 days later. There was no worldly music, no eulogies that elevated him above his position as a servant of Jehovah, no excessive crying that could indicate lack of faith in the resurrection. Elder David Thompson gave the talk, 30 minutes of scriptures about paradise hope interspersed with brief mentions of my son. He focused mainly on how Timothy had remained faithful until death, how he had maintained his integrity, how his sacrifice had given a powerful witness to the doctors and nurses who witnessed our family choosing obedience to Jehovah over life in this dying system. Several people commented afterwards that it was a beautiful funeral, that it glorified Jehovah's name, that it certainly planted seeds in the hearts of worldly people who watched from outside. But I could barely hear the words. I was sitting in the front row, James on one side and my mother on the other, staring at the closed casket that contained my son's body, and all I could think about was how small he looked. Timothy was 5 feet 9, he had just surpassed James in height a few months earlier, something that made my husband laugh and pretend to be offended. But in that casket, he seemed to have shrunk, reverted to the baby I held in my arms 17 years before, the little boy who stood by my bed at 3 a.m. because he had nightmares about Armageddon, the quiet teenager who never complained but whose eyes betrayed a sadness I had chosen not to see. The following weeks dragged on in a fog of condolences and well-intentioned attempts at comfort. Brothers from the congregation brought food, stayed for a few hours, recited scriptures about Jehovah being close to the brokenhearted. They told me I had made the right choice, the courageous choice, the choice that would ensure I would see Timothy again in paradise. They told me I was an example to other parents, that my faith in impossible circumstances had strengthened the entire congregation. Some shared similar stories of witnesses in other countries who had chosen death instead of transfusions, modern-day martyrs who proved that Jehovah's people were willing to sacrifice everything for the truth. But at night, when the house was quiet and James was sleeping, I lay awake staring at the ceiling and wondering things I would never dare say aloud. I wondered if Jehovah truly cared about a few milliliters of blood when weighed against my son's life. I wondered how something that would save a life could be so offensive to the Creator of life. I wondered if the men who wrote the Watchtower publications in their comfortable offices in New York had ever held a dead child in their arms and questioned whether obedience should really cost everything. I pushed those thoughts away as soon as they arose, recognizing them as Satan's attacks, doubts designed to steer me away from the truth in my moment of greatest vulnerability. But they kept coming back, persistent as flies, buzzing on the periphery of my consciousness even when I tried to stifle them with prayer and Bible study, and even more intense participation in congregation activities. James dealt with the pain differently. He dove into his responsibilities as an elder with an intensity that bordered on fanaticism. He was at the Kingdom Hall every night, conducting Bible studies, preparing talks, counseling other congregation members. He rarely spoke about Timothy, except to reinforce the narrative that had been established, that our son had been faithful until death, that we had honored his dedication to Jehovah, that we would see him again in paradise. But I saw how he avoided Timothy's room, how he changed the subject when someone mentioned the car accident, how his hands trembled when he prayed before meals, sitting at the table that used to accommodate 3, and now seemed vast and empty with just the 2 of us. 6 months after the funeral, I started having panic attacks. The first happened during a meeting at the Kingdom Hall. The elder was giving a talk on maintaining integrity in a fallen world, and he used Timothy as an example. He talked about how our family had demonstrated unwavering faith, how we had chosen to obey Jehovah even when it meant letting our son die. The words were like punches, each one hitting some deep place inside me that I was trying to keep buried. My vision started to narrow. My heart raced. I couldn't breathe, couldn't think, couldn't do anything but get up and run out of the hall, past rows of surprised witnesses, stumbling out the front door to the parking lot where I fell to my knees on the cold asphalt and vomited until nothing was left. A sister found me there, helped me clean up, took me home while murmuring soft words about how grief took time, how Jehovah would understand my momentary weakness, how I should pray more fervently for strength. But the attacks continued. They happened in supermarkets, when I saw teenage boys who reminded me of Timothy. They happened when I drove past the hospital on the way to meetings. They happened late at night when I finally admitted to myself that I was angry, furious even, at Jehovah for demanding this kind of obedience, at the organization for making it seem so clear and simple when it was neither, at James for never questioning, at the elders for standing there with their Bibles while my son bled to death, and most of all at myself for saying no, for choosing doctrine over my son, for believing that was what love meant. I sought help from an elder, not James because I couldn't talk to him about it, but Elder Robert Mitchell who had been there at the hospital. I told him about the panic attacks, about the anger, about the doubts that were consuming my faith like gangrene. He was kinder than I expected. He prayed with me, gave me scriptures to study, assured me that these feelings were normal, that Jehovah would not abandon me if I continued seeking him through the organization. But then he said something that chilled my blood. He said I needed to be careful with these doubts, that apostate thinking started exactly like this, with questioning Jehovah's organization. He said that if I allowed those doubts to grow, I might find myself disfellowshipped, cut off from everything and everyone I loved. The threat was implicit but clear. Be quiet. Swallow the pain. Don't question. Or lose everything you still have left. So I was quiet. I continued going to meetings, continued smiling at the brothers, continued pretending I was fine, when I was breaking apart inside. Timothy's room remained exactly as he had left it, his clothes still in the closet, his Bible study book still on the desk, his scent still lingering in the covers even months later. James wanted to clean everything out, donate the clothes, turn the room into an office, but I wouldn't let him. It was the only piece of my son I still had, and I clung to it with the desperation of a drowning person. 2 years and 3 months after Timothy died, I was sitting in the same spot I always sat in at the Kingdom Hall, 3rd row on the left side, listening with half an ear as Elder Mitchell made announcements before the public talk began. There was a new preaching campaign. There was a need for volunteers to clean the Kingdom Hall next week. There was a visiting witness who had recently moved to the area. And then, almost casually, he said there was new light from Jehovah on the issue of blood fractions. I didn't understand initially. My brain was on autopilot after 2 years of just existing, just surviving each day without really living any of them. But then he kept talking, explaining that the Watchtower, in its increasing understanding of Jehovah's will, had determined that certain smaller blood fractions were now a matter of individual conscience rather than an absolute prohibition. Clotting factors, immunoglobulins, albumin, hemoglobin in certain forms. The list went on, medical terms I had learned during those awful hours at the hospital, treatments the doctors had mentioned, options that had been rejected because they violated our understanding of God's law on blood. The world seemed to tilt on its axis. I heard the words, but they didn't make sense, couldn't make sense, because if this was true now, if this was acceptable to Jehovah now, then what had it been when Timothy was dying? Elder Mitchell continued, his voice steady and confident, explaining how this showed that Jehovah was progressively guiding his organization, how new light sometimes meant a refined understanding of previously established principles. He read Proverbs chapter 4, verse 18. The path of the righteous is like the bright light that gets brighter and brighter until the day is firmly established. I wanted to scream. I wanted to stand up and shout that my son was dead because of an understanding that was now being refined, that I had followed rules that were now being adjusted, that I had let Timothy die for obedience that was now being reinterpreted. But I did nothing. I sat there, my hands clasped in my lap, my nails cutting into my palms while Elder Mitchell finished the announcements and the public talk began. James was sitting next to me, and I could feel his tension, the way his body had gone rigid when the announcements were made. But he said nothing, didn't look at me, just kept staring straight ahead with that expression I had learned to recognize as his way of blocking out anything too painful to process. After the meeting, I tried to talk to James about it. We waited until we got home, until we were alone in the privacy of our kitchen where no one could hear us. I said Timothy's name for the first time in months. I said we needed to talk about what Elder Mitchell had announced, about what this new light meant in relation to the decision we had made. James turned his back to me and started making tea, his hands busy with the kettle, with the cups, with anything that would prevent him from looking at me. He said Jehovah had his reasons. He said it wasn't our place to question the organization's timing in revealing truths. He said Timothy had died faithful, and that was all that mattered, and that I needed to stop picking at wounds that Jehovah was trying to heal. But I couldn't stop. For the first time in 2 years, something inside me had woken up, a rage I could no longer push down. I asked James if he didn't see the contradiction, if he didn't understand that the same blood fractions that were now acceptable had been prohibited when our son needed them. I asked how he could simply accept this without question, without pain, without acknowledging that maybe, just maybe, we had made a terrible mistake by trusting imperfect men to interpret God's will. He finally turned to me, and there was something in his eyes I had never seen before. Fear. Pure, absolute fear. He told me to stop talking. He said that kind of thinking was apostasy. He said that if I continued down that path, I would lose him too, because he wouldn't stay married to someone who turned against Jehovah's organization. That night marked the beginning of the end of my marriage. James withdrew even further, spending more and more time at the Kingdom Hall, avoiding being alone with me where I could ask questions he didn't want to answer. I started doing my own research, something that was heavily discouraged but not technically forbidden. I looked for information about the Jehovah's Witness blood policy, about how it had changed over the years, about how many people had died in each iteration of the rules. I discovered that in the 40s, vaccines were prohibited. In the 60s, organ transplants were considered cannibalism. In the 80s, certain blood fractions started to be permitted. Each change was presented as new light from Jehovah, but the pattern was undeniable. The organization was constantly adjusting, refining, reinterpreting, and people were dying with every adjustment. I found online forums, places where former Jehovah's Witnesses shared their stories. I read about other families who had lost children, parents, spouses for refusing transfusions. I read about people who had been disfellowshipped for accepting medical treatments that later became acceptable. I read about the psychological trauma, about the post-traumatic stress disorder that came from growing up in a high-control environment where doctrine changed, but loyalty was always demanded without question. And for the first time since Timothy died, I didn't feel alone. There were others like me, carrying the weight of choices made in obedience to authority that proved to be fallible. I started missing meetings. First occasionally, making up headaches or feeling unwell. Then more frequently, until I was only going once a month, then only for the annual memorial. James pleaded with me to reconsider. The elders came to our house, worried about my spirituality, offering help, asking if there was anything they could do. I told them I needed time, that I was struggling with grief, that I was doing the best I could. But the truth was that I was slowly waking up from a dream that had lasted 55 years, and the process of awakening was more painful than anything I had experienced before. 3 months after the announcement about blood fractions, I finally gathered the courage to do what I had been avoiding since Timothy's death. I went into his room for the first time in over 2 years with the intention of really seeing, really looking, really understanding who my son had been beyond the facade of the obedient witness he presented to the world. I started with his desk, opening drawers full of study material, carefully underlined Watchtower magazines, talk notes written in his small, neat handwriting. Everything looked exactly as it should, evidence of a young man dedicated to Jehovah. But then I moved the mattress, looking for sheets to wash, and I found the diary. It was small, with a brown leather cover, hidden in a hole Timothy had cut in the box spring upholstery. My first reaction was to put it back, not read it, respect his privacy even in death. But something made me open it, turn to the first page, start reading the words my son had written but never shared. And with every page, with every dated entry, my heart broke in new ways I didn't know were possible. Timothy had written about feeling trapped. About waking up every morning with the weight of expectations he hadn't asked for. About pretending to believe things that made no sense to him because disappointing his parents was unthinkable. About watching other teenagers live freely while every aspect of his life was dictated by rules made by men he would never meet. There were pages about a girl at school he had fallen in love with, knowing he could never date her because she wasn't a witness. There were entries about wanting to go to university, study engineering, have a career, but being discouraged because the end was near, and higher education was pursuing worldly goals. There was one particularly devastating entry written 2 weeks before his death, where he wondered if it would be better not to exist than to continue living a double life, always hiding who he really was behind a mask of obedience. Reading those words was like losing Timothy a second time, but worse because now I knew the truth. My son hadn't died faithful to Jehovah. He had died trapped by doctrine he didn't believe in, sacrificed on the altar of belief that I had forced upon him since before he had the capacity to choose for himself. And the decision I had made at the hospital, the choice I thought honored his dedication, had been based on a completely false assumption. Timothy would never have chosen to die for those beliefs if the choice had truly been his. He would have chosen to live, go to university, date that girl, have the life he had written about with such longing on pages hidden under his mattress. I sat on his bedroom floor, holding that diary, and finally allowed myself to cry for real for the first time since his death. Not the controlled crying that was acceptable at the meetings, not the quiet tears I shed alone at night. But devastating sobs that came from somewhere so deep inside me that I didn't know it existed. I cried for the son I had lost. I cried for the boy he had been, forced to grow up too fast, burdened with spiritual responsibilities before he was ready. I cried for the conversations we never had, for the questions he never asked because he was afraid of the answers. I cried for the life he should have lived, for the grandchildren I will never know, for the future that was stolen from him by obedience to an organization that changed its rules 2 years too late. James found me there hours later, still holding the diary, my face swollen from crying. He saw what I was holding and knew immediately what it was. He reached out, asking to read it, but I shook my head. I told him he didn't want to know, that he couldn't handle knowing, that it was better to keep believing the narrative we had built. But he insisted, so I handed him the diary and watched as he read, his expression changing from page to page, from confusion to disbelief to something that looked like absolute despair. When he finished, he closed the diary carefully, placed it on Timothy's desk, and walked out of the room without saying a word. That night he slept in the guest room, and he never came back to our bed again. I write this now, 3 years after Timothy's death, as a completely different woman from the one who sat in the hospital waiting room, and chose doctrine over her son. I no longer go to meetings. James and I are separated, awaiting what the organization calls a scriptural divorce, although neither of us committed adultery. We simply can no longer live in the same house, carrying the weight of what we did, of what we allowed to be done. He chose to remain a witness, diving even deeper into the organization as a way to cope. I chose to leave, knowing it meant losing everyone and everything I knew, but unable to continue pretending everything was fine. The disfellowshipping came 6 months ago. Not because I asked for it, but because I started speaking openly about my doubts, about the blood policy, about how the new light on fractions had come too late for Timothy. The elders called me in for a judicial committee meeting, 3 men sitting at a table asking me questions about my faith, about whether I still believed this was Jehovah's organization. I told the truth. I said I didn't know any more, that I didn't trust an organization that changed rules that cost lives. That was apostasy enough. I was disfellowshipped for spreading doubts and refusing to repent. My mother no longer speaks to me. My lifelong friends avoid me on the street. The price of leaving is losing everyone you love, and that is intentional design, a way to punish disloyalty and prevent others from asking the same questions. But for the first time in 3 years, I can breathe. I can think my own thoughts without fear of them being monitored for orthodoxy. I can honor Timothy's memory not by pretending he died happily out of conviction, but by recognizing that he died trapped by doctrine he didn't fully believe in, and that I, his mother, was an instrument of that imprisonment. I tell this story not for revenge but for truth. Because while I cannot bring Timothy back, while I cannot undo the choice I made on that horrible night at the hospital, I can make sure his death means something. It can alert other parents, other families, to the danger of putting loyalty to the organization above their children's well-being. It can encourage people who are having doubts to trust those instincts instead of suffocating them with fear. It can, just perhaps, save a life by making someone question whether obedience should really cost everything. Timothy couldn't speak for himself. So I speak for him now, and for all the other witnesses who died hoping their obedience meant something, only for the doctrine to change after they were no longer here to benefit from that change.